We're joined once again today by Tim Wise, who is an anti-racist educator and author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, there's this new study from the Public Religion Research Institute, which found that in spite of always hearing about that phrase, which has become almost a joke, I'm not racist, I have black friends, that in fact, for a lot of Americans, it's not actually the case. And the study shows that for every 91 white friends that the average white American has, they have one black friend, one Asian friend, one Latino friend, one mixed race friend, and 3 friends of unknown race, which is interesting. We could even look into that, but we're going to skip over that for now. And this also exists for African Americans and for other groups, albeit to a slightly lesser extent. So while African Americans have about 10 times as many African American friends as white friends, white Americans have about 91 times as many white friends as black friends. So first, let's take this from the broadest perspective. To what could we attribute this disproportionality?
Well, there are a lot of ways to look at it. I think the most obvious is that the level of residential segregation, both historical and also contemporary, is going to result in people living in communities and around folks who are mostly like themselves. However, for people of color, if you're black or brown in this country, you sort of have to interact with white folks. You're going to run into white folks. We're pretty hard to avoid. We're like Visa. We're everywhere you want to be, right? And so people of color, whether they're coming out in the employment world or in colleges or wherever it is, are going to have to interact with us. So they're more likely to be able statistically to develop at least a few friendships with white folks, whereas white folks really have had historically, and I would say still today, the luxury, if we choose, to construct these lives that are essentially racially isolated. White folks, according to all the research, are more racially isolated than people of color. For every white folks on average, there was a study several years ago, found that only about 3% of the people that white folks come across in a given day are African American, whereas over 50% of the people that black folks come in contact with are white, even if they live in mostly black neighborhoods, because they come out of those neighborhoods for work, et cetera. So I think the history of segregation probably has the most to do with it, where we live, where we don't live, both because of historic patterns and also ongoing discrimination.
And last time you were on, we talked a little bit about kind of the subtle nature of what is described as white privilege, which isn't white people have to get down on their knees and apologize to black people. But one of the examples we talked about was, if you're white, you never, in the US for the most part, you never have to say, oh, if I show up at this place, am I going to be the only person who looks like me, or will there be others? And I think that the study really helps to illustrate that, which is a really subtle point to some people.
Right. Well, I think, for most white folks, we really don't have to think about that. Not only because the housing opportunities have been greater, we really have been able to move pretty much wherever our checkbook would allow us to move. On the other hand, we know from the research that for black folks, for Latinos, for people of color generally, even when they have the money to move into neighborhoods that might be more affluent, better resourced schools, more job opportunities, that they are often steered away from those neighborhoods by real estate agents, or discriminated against in lending. So there was a study several years ago which found, for instance, that if where black people lived was solely a function of what they could afford, only about 1 or 2% of the black community would live in mostly black neighborhoods. They would be much more diffuse, much more dispersed, but because residential location is not solely a function of what you can afford when you're a person of color, because discrimination still comes into play, we end up with this significant isolation that people of color have to think about when they're looking for where they might want to live, whereas white folks really don't have to think about that.
Moving to New York City from Massachusetts for me has been a pretty interesting experience, because as someone who on paper is a Hispanic immigrant from Argentina to the US, I am designated in one way. The reality, of course, is that I moved early enough to not speak English with an accent, and I'm the descendant of Eastern European Jews. So for all practical purposes, racially, I'm white in this country. Right. And moving to New York City, the total lack of diversity of Massachusetts was immediately evident, where in Massachusetts you have a Hispanic and African American population, which is quite small and is pretty segregated in South Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts. Here in New York City, as someone who takes the subway every day, instantly your exposure to all different types of people grows exponentially. And
Right.
the relationships that existed in Massachusetts, I haven't yet put my fingers and my head around exactly how qualitatively it's different, but the interracial relationships that I observed in Massachusetts were drastically different than those that I observe here in New York, and I'm not exactly sure why or how.
Well, I think there are two things, right? Number one, let's not overstate just how sort of ecumenical and integrated a place like New York is, because the reality is, in terms of neighborhood by neighborhood analysis,
Certainly.
New York is one of the most segregated cities on the face of the earth, certainly in this country. So that, yeah, on the island of Manhattan and throughout Brooklyn and Queens, you've got a lot of interaction, maybe less so in the Bronx now, but still, where people live, very much a function of race and socioeconomics and the interaction of that. So people run into one another. But I think even in a place like New York, unless you're prepared, particularly as someone who's classified as white, to sort of go out of the confines and the boundaries of those experiences that are normal or comfortable for you, that it can still be really tough to make close friends of another race, culture, or ethnicity in a place like that. And then the second point I would make, I'm from the South. I've lived in the South all my life. And there's sort of an old saying that I'm not sure really where it comes from, but the saying was that in the South, white folks didn't really care how close black people got. They just didn't want them to get too high. And in the North, white folks didn't care how high black folks got. They just didn't want them to be too close. In other words, in the South, we had an intimacy and a familiarity, which of course was undergirded by systemic oppression. But in terms of proximity, to be Southern and white meant that you did in fact interact, not on a level of equality, but nonetheless interacted and came in contact with black folks on a pretty regular basis. And as a result, could sort of unfortunately have this naive belief that, oh, we're friendly, everybody's friendly down here, we all get along great. In the North, the segregation was in many ways much more intense in the sense of real distance, you all living over here and we're living over here. Whereas in the South, it might have just been a railroad track or literally a road in the middle of town across which black folks lived and across which white folks lived. So the danger of the friendship argument, really, which so many people use to sort of get out of the conversation, is that in the South, we've always had those friendly relationships. We've always had those pleasantries and those intimacies, and some of them were even genuine. But underneath all that, right, was this much deeper systemic structure that I think is easily missed when we focus on the interpersonal as opposed to the institutional.
Okay, which really gets me to the last thing I wanted to touch on, which is some would say, some studies indicate that when you ask people about their individual prejudices when they come to race, that they are significantly less marked now than they were in past periods in the United States. Systemically speaking, we certainly don't have slavery anymore. We have the Civil Rights Act, but systemically, there are still many racist infrastructures in this country.
Right.
Is it more likely that the systemic racism will decrease, although it is kind of trailing behind the decrease in individual racism, for lack of a better term? Or is that not something that is just going to kind of naturally go away as individual prejudices change?
I think that the danger is that systemic bias can be sustained without individual bias precisely because it's so much harder to notice when you're not the one being affected by it. I think the danger of the personal connection and maybe the reduction in personal hatred and bigotry is that it allows white folks to say, well, because whites generally don't have these horribly bigoted views anymore, at least we don't express them openly, that somehow the problem is gone. I think in some ways it was easier to see the systems when the bias was pretty openly expressed. So I'm not convinced that one will lead to the eradication of the other. And let's remember, even back in the early 60s, during the height of the civil rights movement, when overt racism was much more common, both at an individual level and obviously at the institutional level, the vast majority of white Americans, according to Gallup polls in 62 and 63, between 2/3 and 85% of white Americans said that they believed that racial minorities, the quote they used at the time, that racial minorities had equal opportunity and were treated equally. So white folks didn't see the systems even when they were blatant. And my fear is that we're having an even harder time seeing that now. So the personal connection, the reduction in personal bias to the extent that it's real, and I'm not altogether convinced that it's dropped as much as we think, is certainly good. But in a society where the polls say that as many as 6 out of 10 white Americans are still willing to admit that in general they view black folks as less hardworking, and they say the only reason they're trailing whites is because they don't have the right work ethic. If white America, if 6 out of 10 are going to say that about the black community, that's a still racist belief. It may not be biological racism. It may not be saying these people are inherently inferior. But if you think that the condition of African Americans today, in terms of unemployment, poverty, schooling, et cetera, is because they lack the proper drive and determination, you're making a statement about this broad community that, in my opinion, makes it very unlikely that you're capable of treating any individual from that group fairly when they come into your place of employment or when they're a student in your classroom. So I'm not convinced the personal bias has gone away nearly as much as we think, and I'm very certain that historically institutional bias can be maintained regardless of the personal levels of bigotry.
We've been speaking with Tim Wise. He is an anti-racist educator and also author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, thanks so much for being on again with us.
You bet. Thank you.